Now, this morning, as we continue in the story, Brian last week told you a little bit about a king named David. Many people in the church are very familiar with David. A lot of it is because he was so real. You know, the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, he is called a man after God's own heart. And yet, when you look at his life, he messed up a lot. But the thing to really focus on is not that he messed up a lot, because that's a given. That's a given with you. It's a given with me. We're going to mess up. But what distinguished him as a man after God's own heart is what he did when he found out that he had messed up. Because sometimes the same thing happened in his mind that happens in your mind. We begin to justify whatever it is that we've done, or we just don't even feel like we've done anything wrong in the first place, and then someone comes along and points it out to us, and then it determines on what happens. So often today, when someone comes along and points it out to us, we get upset. We become angry. And David, even though, like Nathan, when Nathan tells him the story, and you heard that last week, tells him the story about the man who comes and takes advantage of his neighbor, his poor neighbor, how he takes that lamb away. You remember how upset David got, but then all of a sudden Nathan says, David, you are that man. And what's it say that David did? Immediately he said, I've sinned against God. I've sinned against God. And he began to repent. He began to turn his life around once again. You want to know why David is a man after God's own heart? Because when he discovered, whether it's self-discovery or by someone else telling him he had messed up, it's because he repented. It's because each time he knew that he had sinned against God, that he had hurt God in some way and hurt others as well. And so he would come back to God and he would repent. He would mourn over what he had done. And so he was called this man after God's own heart, and he served faithfully his God and his King. And now he's at the end of his life. Chapter 1 of 1 Kings says that as he's grown older, as he's gotten older, he can't stay warm. Anybody have that in here, by the way? As you get older, you can't stay warm. And he's very old. He's on his deathbed. He can't stay warm. Now, this next part I'm not going to recommend, okay? But they brought in a young virgin. Her name was Abishag. And Abishag was basically used to put in bed with David so that he could stay warm. So now you see why I'm not saying we should use that. But that's what Abishag was used for. I mean, she was a young woman, and so she was placed in bed with David to keep him warm. Well, during this time, David is considering who he's going to pass the kingdom on to. The natural one to be passed along to would be the oldest son, okay? And yet, the oldest son in all of this is scheming. He's trying to make it happen. But during this time that David is on this deathbed, Bathsheba comes in and basically says to him, I want you to remember that you promised that a son of mine would be the heir to the throne, and her son was Solomon. And David said, I do remember that. In fact, I will honor that. And so she says, well, you have to decree it. You have to say it. And so David said it in the presence of witnesses. And that's where we find ourselves in the story. And so I want to read, if you would, there in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And then I want to make some observations just about those verses. When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. I'm about to go the way of all the earth, he said, so be strong. Show yourself a man and observe what the Lord your God requires. What does he require? Walk in his ways, keep his decrees and commands, his laws and requirements as written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. Now you yourself know what Joab, son of Zeruiah, it's easy to say, Zeruiah did to me. That's where we're going to leave it. What he did to the two commanders of Israel's armies, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether. He killed them, shedding their blood in peacetime as if in battle, and with that blood stained the belt around his waist and the sandals on his feet. Deal with him according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. In other words, don't let him die in peace. Don't let him die in peace. But show kindness to the sons of Barzillai of Gilead, and let them be among those who eat at your table. They stood by me when I fled from your brother Absalom. And remember you have with Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite from Bahurim, who called down bitter curses on me the day I went to Mahanaim. When he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, I will not put you to death by the sword. But now do not consider him innocent. You are a man of wisdom. You will know what to do to him. Bring his gray head down to the grave in blood. And then David rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. He had reigned 40 years over Israel, 7 years in Hebron, and 33 in Jerusalem. So Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his rule was firmly established. Now, here are some observations. One of the things that David says to his son is, be strong and show yourself a man. You need to understand that Solomon is probably only about 20 years old at this time. And I don't know about you, but I've been really thinking about that. I was probably 24 when I began to preach. Is that right? And I preached in this little church in Southern Illinois, Broadway Christian Church in Salem, Illinois. It was the church that I was baptized in. I was very comfortable there in the building. But I always remember what Ruby Busby used to say about the people in that church. She said that Broadway was a church of maladjusted people. And it seemed like when anybody would get happy at another congregation, that was the kind of growth that we had. You know, they would come to Broadway. And after all, they're dealing with a young man who really doesn't know a whole lot. I mean, really didn't. And I remember how intimidated I would be when people would come in, guests who would come in. There was a guy from the Ozarks. He used to have, I can't remember his name, but he was down in the Ozarks. He went to Ozark Bible College, and back when it was a Bible college. And he came in on a Sunday night. I don't know if Jennifer remembers this, but we were in the book of Revelation. That's how foolish I was. At 24, I was trying to preach through the book of Revelation on Sunday evenings. And all of these people, you know, what I had was, we kind of had like an open forum, you know, because I had people who would disagree with me and all this kind of stuff. But what I want you to see in that was during that time, it prepared me. It prepared me to deal with a bigger church of maladjusted people. You know, and that's what I discovered, is that no matter where you go, the church is the church, and the church is made up of a bunch of imperfect people. Why? Because God says, you come to me just as you are. You come to me just as you are. And we're on a journey together, and we're at different places along that journey, and yet, honestly, there's not a person here who can say, hey, I have done it all, I've arrived, I've experienced it all, and I am mature. No, that doesn't happen. It happens for men like Winfred and Bob and Bill and Ray, because they've gone home. And that is when we are completed. But we're on this journey to be complete. But in order to do that, we have to make that admission that we are indeed maladjusted. We're maladjusted to the ways of God. You know, we're more familiar with the ways of the world, and quite frankly, sometimes we're more comfortable with the ways of the world. And yet God calls us to be his people, to be his hands and his feet, to be his voice, to be his arms. We sang about God's arms, you know, wrapping around us, but we are to do that for each other. It's the reason Terry and Kathy have gone over to be with Winfred's family, to be those arms, to be that voice that brings peace and comfort. Well, anyway, the point being is at 24, there were some things that I really didn't understand, you know. And so I can't even imagine it being 20 years of age and being ordained as the king of a nation. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, it's part of the reason that we require presidents to at least be older than that, right? Politicians have to be, well, not all politicians, but as to run for president, you have to be, 35? Am I right on that? Thank you. It's been a long time. 8th grade. Remember the Constitution and all that stuff in 8th grade? So, 20 years of age, he has become the king of Israel. And in 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon acknowledges his inexperience. He goes before God. God comes to him and says, hey, what do you want? And here's what he asked for. It's kind of amazing that at 20 years of age, he actually asked for wisdom. You know, because, you know, that proverbial genie in a bottle, you know, if we were ever to discover a bottle that a genie would pop out of, young men, is that what you'd really ask for at 20 years of age? No, you probably ask for money, wealth. You probably ask for power. You might ask for the most beautiful woman in the world. I don't know what you'd ask for, but very few people would actually ask for wisdom. But that's what Solomon asked for. He asked for wisdom, and God was pleased. I mean, God was pleased with that. The second observation, he says after that, you know, be strong, show yourself a man. And then he says, observe what the Lord your God requires. Well, what does he require? He requires that we walk in his ways. He requires that we keep his decrees. And he requires that we obey him in order to prosper. Prosper. Now, I think all those things are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on them. But I will spend some time on that last one because of the day and age in which we live. I want you to understand this has nothing really to do with prosperity in the ways of the world. It has to do with how you look before God. Because if you look and are walking with God and you're keeping his decrees and you are obeying him, he will bless you through anything. He is not going to necessarily protect you from certain things, but he will bless you through everything. Do you understand what I'm saying? He will bless you through the difficult times. He will bless you. We sang in the song, earth has no sorrows that heaven can't heal. That's what it means to prosper in the Lord. There are no sorrows. There are no difficulties that he cannot heal with the promise of eternal life and an eternity with him. There's nothing that he can't heal. Fear. He heals fear by being with us. I know I've used this illustration before, but any of you have had grandchildren or children understand. Last night, as we laid down, we had the boys last night, and so neither one of us really rested real well because we have a king-size bed, which is great, okay? If we could get the boys to lay straight. But they go sideways, don't they? You guys know. They go sideways, and so I was kicked, she was punched, you know, all night long. And yet, I mean, what a wonderful experience. But here's what I want to tell you. Riker, when we first went in, Riker's like, it's dark. We're like, it'll get lighter. You know, you can see we leave a light on in our living room. And so you can kind of see that light coming around in the hallway. And then the street light is outside. And so you know how it is. When you first turn the light off, it's pretty dark, but then your eyes adjust. And so we turn the light out. Maddox is just on his knees straight up. He's next to me, and I'm saying, buddy, lay down. He's just completely quiet. Riker is saying to Jennifer, it's dark. Well, wait, buddy, it's dark. Wait, it's dark. And she's like, well, lay down. And here's the thing, when they're with you, they may speak that they're a little afraid, but when they're with you, Riker finally laid down because he's with us, just like he would with his mom and dad. And then the really cool thing, and this is why I say, guys, be faithful and teach, okay? Because the really cool thing is, I said, Riker, talk to your brother. And Riker says, buddy, it's okay. It's okay. If you need to, lay down on me. Lay your head on me. And that's exactly what Maddox did. He laid his head on his big brother's shoulder, and he went to sleep. Quickly went to sleep. Jennifer said to Riker, scoot over here, because she knew I was like on the edge, all right? And so she's like, scoot over here next to Granny. And he goes, I can't. Why? Because Maddox is on my arm. So we get him. So that's the point, We don't have anything to fear. David said that in Psalm 23. We don't have anything to fear because God goes with us. He's always with us. And so that's his prosperity. The prosperity of the world doesn't matter. It's going to disappear. And I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying it's going to disappear. Our hope and our heart shouldn't be focused in that stuff, but it should be focused on pleasing him so that he will always be with us, no matter what. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't heal. A third observation is that from chapter 2, verse 5 and following, David actually offers some personal advice. I started to put political advice because that's kind of what it is. I mean, if you follow along with the story, every one of these men has threatened David politically, and they've also threatening Solomon politically. And so for Joab, he basically says death. Now, I know he says don't let him go down to his grave in peace, but that's what he means. He means as soon as you get the opportunity, put him to death. Okay? And so then for the sons of Barzillai, he says show kindness. Why? Because they showed kindness to me. So show kindness to them. And then for Shimei, he says, again, death. And he's pretty straightforward on that one. Don't let him go to his grave without, his blood being shed or something like that. Make sure you spill his blood. And so for Shimei, he says death. And Solomon eventually deals with each of these as David has instructed. And we'll come across those in a little bit. So those are some observations that I made about those verses there. Now, 1 Kings 2:12 establishes Solomon as king of Israel. That's exactly what it says, that he began to establish his rule over Israel. Okay? Now, the problem is that David's oldest son, Adonijah, attempts to steal the throne from him. And there's a couple of attempts to do this. One is earlier on in chapter 1, he begins to scheme. He raises up his own prophet, he raises up his own priest, and he basically takes some people and he goes and he has himself named king. Well, the problem with that is once David announces that Solomon is going to be the king, it kind of trumps his whole attempt, okay? And so Solomon sees through the next plan, which the next plan is this. Once Adonijah saw that he wasn't going to be king, the next thing that he did was go to Bathsheba and say, I have a request, and please don't deny me this request. She says, what is it? And he says, may I take Abishag, the Shunammite, as my wife? Remember Abishag? Abishag was the last one to lay down with David. Now, there's no indication that they were involved in a sexual manner or anything. It's just that, by all intents and purposes, she was his last wife. So now what happens if Adonijah takes Abishag as his wife? He becomes king. It's the same kind of thing that Absalom tried before, whenever whenever David basically had him killed. And so Solomon sees right through his plan, and so he has Adonijah killed. He says, surely he will die for this request. You know, this is what he's asking for. He's trying to steal the kingdom from me, and so he has him killed. Solomon then sends Abiathar, who was the priest that Adonijah had chosen, had picked up. He sends him back to the fields. He says, you're no longer a priest. You're going to go back to the fields. You're going to work hard. And Abiathar goes. Next, he has Joab struck down at the altar. See, in all of the dealings, Joab knows that he's next. I mean, he knows that Solomon's going to be dealing with him. And so he goes to the tent of meeting, and at the tent of meeting on each end of the altar are these two horns that come out of the altar. And so he went to one end of the altar. Now, this isn't the Ark of the Covenant, okay, because if he had touched it, he's dying anyway. But he goes there and he grabs a hold of these horns, and what he's asking for is asylum. He goes there to ask for asylum. That's what they would do if they accidentally killed someone. They went to the tent of meeting. If they couldn't get to a safe city, they would go to the tent of meeting. They would grab a hold of these horns, and they're asking for asylum. And when the general of Solomon goes to him and tries to get him to step away from the altar, he won't. And so Solomon finally gives the order, we'll kill him there. And so he goes and he kills Joab there at the altar. And then Shimei meets his fate 3 years later. Originally what Solomon says is to Shimei is, I want you to stay in Jerusalem. You build a house here in Jerusalem, but you don't leave Jerusalem. The first time that I hear that you cross the Kidron Valley or you leave the city of Jerusalem, I will kill you. Pretty straightforward, ain't it? So 3 years later, things have been going well for Shimei, and some of his slaves escape, and he decides to go after them. Well, when he gets back after going after the slaves, Solomon basically goes to him, and this kind of speech, what part about that did you not understand? So now that you've left the city, as I told you not to, you must be put to death. And so they put Shimei, and he meets his fate 3 years later. So now all of his political enemies are gone. In 1 Kings chapter 3, I've talked about this already, but Solomon asked for wisdom, and that request pleases God. And it's because of his young age, his inexperience, that Solomon asked for this gift of discernment. Now, the reason I'm telling you and reminding you about this again is because after he asked, he is immediately tested. And so if you go to chapter 3, verse 16. Go to chapter 3, verse 16. Now 2 prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One of them said, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house. I had a baby while she was there with me. The third day after my baby was born, this woman also had a baby. We were alone. There was no one in the house but the two of us. And during the night, this woman's son died because she lay on him. So she got up in the middle of the night, took my son from my side while I, your servant, was asleep. She put him by her breast and put her dead son by my breast. The next morning I got up to nurse my son, and he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning light, I saw that it wasn't the son I had born. The other woman said, no, the living one is my son, the dead one is yours. But the first one insisted, no, the dead one is yours, and the living one is mine. And so they argued before the king. And the king said, this one says, my son is alive and your son is dead, while that one says, no, your son is dead, and mine is alive. And then the king said, bring me a sword. So they brought a sword for the king. He then gave an order, cut the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other. The woman whose son was alive was filled with compassion for her son and said to the king, please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him. Now, honestly, ladies, wouldn't you respond in the same way? If that is your child, you're not going to allow this to happen. You would rather your child live with someone else than be cut in half obviously. And so he exercises his wisdom. The others said, "Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in two." Then the king gave his ruling, "Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She is his mother." And then verse 28, when all Israel heard the verdict the king had given, they held the king in awe because they saw that he had wisdom from God to administer justice. And so he gives a very good ruling in that time. Now, Solomon builds the temple in chapter 6. Okay? I'm just kind of hitting some of the highlights of his life. David was the one who was given the plans of the temple, but the problem was there was too much blood on his hands. David was a mighty warrior, and so there was too much blood on his hands to build the temple. God would not allow him to build the temple. Now, Solomon comes along, and he is more diplomatic. In fact, Solomon is probably too diplomatic. We'll get to that in a little while. But he's more diplomatic, and so God allows him to begin to build the temple. And so the temple itself was 90 feet long and 30 feet wide. It was modeled after the tabernacle that they had used in the wilderness. So 90 feet long, and what you had as you entered in was kind of a common place, but as you got inside, in fact, the portico or the porch, I guess you would call it, of the temple, there were 2 bronze pillars on each side, or one on each side. And you would step into the temple, into the holy place. In the holy place, it had like the lever, it had the candle stick, the menorah. It had the table of showbread, different things, the altar, different things like that, in the holy place. And then as you got back, there was another room, and this room was the most holy place. It was separated by a veil, and inside the most holy place is where they kept the Ark of the Covenant. 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and it was built out of cedar, pine, juniper, and olive wood. I mean, some expensive woods, really, it was built out of. The cedars of Lebanon were used to build the temple. The temple continued. The most holy place was actually overlaid in gold. All of that wood was overlaid in gold. And so it was a beautiful, beautiful temple. And get this, no one but the high priest once a year would actually get to see that, because he could only enter in the most holy place once a year. It took 7 years to complete. Now, this is the part that will probably blow you away. It took 7 years to complete by 180,000 laborers and 4,000 supervisors. And this is the other part that you may not realize, and I think it's really, really cool. Hammers and chisels rang out at the quarry, but the temple site was to be quiet and reverent. So everything was shaped. It kind of reminds me of how we made this. Some of you may not know this, but these walls, the interior walls, were all made somewhere else. And they were made to fit together. They were numbered, and that's the way we put the interior walls together. In fact, they were made down in Kentucky, right? And so they were shipped up here, and then we would get them, and just like a puzzle, we would put them together. Now, I can tell you this, it wasn't quiet and reverent here all the time. You know, I think reverent, yeah, but maybe not so much. But I know it wasn't quiet in here. But that's kind of an interesting thing, isn't it? That the construction of the temple, the place was to be quiet and was to be reverent. All right, great celebration when the temple was dedicated. All right, so I'm going to try to wrap this up in the next 10 minutes, so we're going to be moving right along, okay? In 1 Kings 9, verses 1 through 9, the Lord appears to Solomon, and God's requirement is repeated. This time, David told him first, this is what God requires. Now it's God appearing to Solomon for a second time and repeating what God requires. He says, walk in my ways. He says, keep my decrees and commands. He says, your family will always rule over Israel if you obey. Okay? But here's the warning. Here's the warning that God gives. If the people do not obey, Israel will be cut off. Israel will be cut off from this land if the people do not obey. And so now, 1 Kings chapter 11, you have the beginning of the end. In fact, turn there to chapter 11, and we're going to read those first two verses. As soon as I find it. King Solomon, however, this is verse 1 of chapter 11. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. Now catch verse 2. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. Solomon held fast to them, but I love them. He was too diplomatic. And where David would protect and conquer by the sword, Solomon would write out peace treaties. And he would marry these. One of the things that you need to understand is that he had 700 wives, and they were all of royal birth. 700 wives of royal birth. You can't really fight the family of your wife. Oh, some of us have tried, but you can't. You can't, and so. And on top of that, he had 300 concubines. Mary Ellen's favorite joke is the preacher, or the kid that said that the preacher went home and said that the preacher said this morning, Mommy, that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 porcupines. But 300 concubines. What are concubines? They have all of the responsibilities of a wife, but none of the credit. Okay? None of the good things of being a wife. All of the responsibilities, but none of the credit. And so this is the beginning of the end. In verse 4, it says that Solomon's heart indeed turned to other gods. Verses 7 and 8 indicate that these were gods who required child sacrifice, two of them, Molech, and I'll have to look for the other one, Chemosh and Molech. They both required child sacrifice. And so maybe Solomon didn't do that, but he allowed his wife to practice those sorts of sacrifices. And so verses 7 and 8 tell us that there were gods who required child sacrifice that he had turned to. And so God strips the kingdom from Solomon. And he tells him that this is going to happen. But he also tells him this, that it's not going to happen until after you die, and then I will take it out of the hands of your son. And so in 930 BC or 922 BC, depending on what you've been taught, what you accept, but 930 BC or 922, the kingdom divides into the northern kingdom of 10 tribes of Israel and the southern kingdom of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. Okay? The northern kingdom is called Israel. The southern kingdom is called Judah. And we'll talk about that more next week. But he strips the kingdom from Solomon and cuts off the people from the land. Now, if you turn to the book of Ecclesiastes, and we'll just go through this real quickly, what is the theme to the book of Ecclesiastes? Yeah, well, vanity, but sometimes vanity is, because the old King James would say, everything is vanity. Now, vanity, what we translate that into is meaningless. Everything is meaningless is what he says in verse 2. And that's really the thesis of the book, that everything is meaningless. And so he begins to note some of those things. Wisdom is meaningless in chapter 1, verse 12. he says that pleasures are meaningless. In fact, he attaches this statement on each one of those. Kyle is watching me, and so I have to take a drink of this. I picked it up, and I started to set it down without taking a drink. So I'm taking a drink. All right, so everything is meaningless. Wisdom is meaningless, pleasures are meaningless, and then he attaches this little phrase. It is a chasing after the wind. Have you ever chased after the wind? I mean, it would be impossible, right? And so that's what he's saying. It's utterly meaningless. It's like a chasing after the wind. Possessions in chapter 2. Possessions, all of our stuff is meaningless because it's going to be destroyed someday. Our toil is meaningless. Promotion is meaningless. You know why? Because that title is going to go away someday. And honestly, the only thing that we ought to be concerned about who we are is if we're saints through Jesus Christ. The only thing that really lasts is being a brother and sister together in the church. That's what matters. And yet we chase after these things. Toil and promotion. And again, please don't hear me in saying that they're not maybe essential in your career or whatever. But understand this, even that career is going to go away one day. It's all going to be gone. And that's the point that he's making through this book of Ecclesiastes. It's meaningless because it's going to be burned up. It's meaningless because it's not going to last. It's meaningless because it's a chasing after the wind. Money and riches. And again, I'm not knocking anybody who has money or who is wealthy. I'm not knocking that. Just understand it's not going with you. And so what does matter? What does matter? Well, if you read chapter 12, and I'm going to leave that to you to do that. Chapter 12 is excellent because he talks about what it's like to grow old. At 20 years of age, he asks for wisdom, and for a while he works in that way. But then later on, he begins all these other pursuits. Women, wine, money, all this stuff. And he is... Solomon is considered to be, at the time, he was the wealthiest person in the world. He was considered to be, and is considered to be, the wisest man to ever live. God promises that there was no one like him before him, and there is no one after him who is like that. So the wisest man comes around, and what he says is, here is the conclusion of things, he says. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commands, for this is the whole duty of man. The whole duty of man. The funny thing is some of us know that that's in there. And yet what we do day in and day out is we pursue, we've listened to this wisest man who says, listen, you can live these other ways, but I'm going to tell you that it ends with everything disappearing. Everything goes. It's meaningless. It's a chasing after the wind. In fact, if you really want to get that, if I saw someone out on the street and they said to me, I said, what are you doing? And they said, well, I'm chasing after that breeze. I mean, if it was a little kid, maybe. But I'm talking about a grown person, grown-up person, and they're out on that street and they're telling me they're chasing after the wind. That person is insane. Don't you see that that's exactly what Solomon is saying to us? That when we pursue these things that don't really matter, then we're insane. Because it's like chasing after the wind. And so he says, our whole duty is to fear God and to keep his commands. There's an old song by Kansas. I love the group Kansas. And John Elefante, when he first joined as the lead vocalist for Kansas, wrote a song called Chasing Shadows. And the chorus says, have we left the answer far behind? Are we running to the light? And the waves are getting deeper, chasing shadows in the night. And, you know, I've thought a lot about the lyrics of that song, and I thought, man, it sounds a lot like it came from Ecclesiastes. You may not know this, but John Elefante and Carrie Livgren of Kansas were both believers. And so a lot of their songs have this theme. Second verse of that song says, tell me, have you noticed the tide is rolling in? The waves are crashing harder now. The shore is wearing thin. And the message in the bottle has been lost at sea. But the words live on forever because it's meant to be. And then they go into the chorus again. Have we left the answers far behind? And are we running for the light? And as the waves are growing deeper, we're chasing shadows in the night. You know, I wonder today how many of us, we really need to consider this message and understand that what we got to do is turn our hearts back towards God. It may be someone who's just kind of lost focus. But it also could be someone here today who needs to do that. Someone like Tyler who says, I've come to a point where I've believed this message long enough. I know this message is true, and so now I have to do something about it. I have to know to come to a point where I will walk in His ways, where I will obey His decrees, and He will prosper me through my life because He'll be with me. And so we're going to enter into a time of invitation. These ladies are going to come and sing. The gentlemen are going to play. And we're just asking that question. Are you willing now to come as you are? To come as you are, to lay down those burdens, to lay down those pursuits, and to come to God just as you are. Would you stand as we sing together?